I was at the Maharishi U. In the 5 years I was there, I spent 18 months in courses that were in length of a month to 3 months, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Then I'd go to the bathroom alone, watch TV, read newspapers, go home, write letters. You went to the bathroom if you were in your dorm alone. But if you were at a meeting and you had to get up, somebody went with you. The days were structured down to seconds, 15 seconds to do this, and you're meditating. So my eyes were closed, let's say 20 hours a day.
Welcome back to If I'm Really Honest, where I seek truth without tribalism. It's a place where curiosity is rewarded, ignorance isn't punished, and conflict doesn't mean contempt. As always, I hope that I've brought you someone that you don't fully agree with, but if you brought yourself, you're already way ahead of me on that one. Today, I invited a leading expert in cult recovery, Patrick Ryan. I reached out to him because of his immense credentials and experience in one of my favorite fields. But I was surprised to find a beautiful kindred spirit. One of the most lovable role models of kindness and open-mindedness I've ever encountered. Ever allergic to black and white thinking and intuitively looking for nuance. Patrick Ryan is one of my new favorite humans. Direct, honest, and open to changing his mind. I went ahead and compiled a little cheat sheet of my favorite Patrick Ryanisms and resources from the interview. So after the episode, check out the link in the description so you can download that. For now, I give you Patrick Ryan. I talk to a lot of people who are very adamant about their view on cults, and I really appreciate your spirit of, just what you said to me about the word cults itself, and also you just seem to be very open to the uniqueness of each situation, which it seems rare in my experience. How rare is that in the industry, in the field?
I think you have to put it in the historical context. And so, I mean, I look at things in a certain context. So the history of this sort of field of concern about cults in the modern times, not, St. Augustine or or one of those people from ancient times were concerned about different sects. But in modern times, really probably started in the early 70s, where people with Ted Patrick, deprogramming people out of the children of God. And there was a view that these groups had this all-powerful controlling method they call mind control, brainwashing, and that someone gets exposed to this, process, that they will change and be a completely different person, and it's pretty extreme, and that's what maybe the media portrayed with some accuracy and some inaccuracy. So when I was in the group I was in, TM, and at the Maharishi University, and this is a little wandering, but I'm trying to answer your question as thoughtfully as I can. I had questions in myself. Is like, am I in a cult? I just was these thoughts, especially when Jonestown happened in 1978. And I remember that occurring, and I missed my first meditation ever. And I was like, I started trying to find things to read. And they were talking about, prior to internet, you had to go to libraries. It was very difficult to gather information. But a book soon came out called Snapping, about sudden personality change. And I read about it, and they described that, these young people interact with a group, and boom, they're like taken away. And so the example that was used most frequently that I recall was the Unification Church, or the Moonies. And people in when I got into the field, were talking about, you have to be very careful if you went to one of their camps, even one of our people would just be overtaken. So I went 3 times to New York City when I was at Maharishi International University during breaks, and tried to get recruited by the Moonies. So I hung out in front of Penn Station where I knew they were recruiting, and then they would come up to me, and I would go through their lecture series, and it didn't do anything. I was like, what is this brainwashing? What is this all powerful, techniques that they're using, I found them annoying to some extent. It was loud. The volume on the videos, or there were tapes, reels, were very loud. So I just couldn't understand this all powerful influence. And when I entered this world of working with people in groups in 83, 84, that was prevailing idea. And it just didn't seem real to me. Um, I recognized that I got swept away, but not everybody got swept away. So what is this all powerful, mind control? And so I think that it's easy to say that it's there, but that's what it is. It's easy. And I promoted those ideas. I mean, I was an anti-cultist out there picketing on TV, doing media, fighting these all-powerful groups. But, after working in the field and my testosterone levels decreased, I, I kind of realized that this is not the same for everybody. And so I think that I come from it from a worldview of a long history, and seeing that, reflecting back on my experience at the Maharishi University, where I had friends who were just as into it as I was, and then they would leave, and they would stop. Faculty members would leave. So how is it that, one day someone was totally in, and then, a month later they were out, and they didn't involve intervention? And then there was a woman who I was at Maharishi International University with, that her parents had her kidnapped in the 70s, late 70s, and deprogrammed. And part of that deprogramming,
Successfully or
well,
no?
successfully, that's an interesting concept. She severed her ties with the group. Successful or not, I think it was damaging. The programmers of that era, that did her case, believed that to prove that she was out, she needed to lose her virginity, and they would provide that service for her. I'm describing it in
Well,
a
that
very
sounds like a
nice
cult.
way. When I know her still to this day, and when I talked to her in the mid '80s and heard what happened to her because her parents believed that this all powerful force had taken her over, I just knew that wasn't real, and it wasn't necessary. There were other ways to approach her. So my history with it is, I mean, at one point I bought into these ideas, even though I had experience with the Unification Church and I didn't see it there. I visited the Krishnas, I visited Scientology, I visited groups, but I just didn't see this all powerful. And in fact, there were people at Maharishi International University who had been Scientologists, and they left the Church of Scientology and they went to the university. They had been in other groups and they left.
Yes.
So it just didn't make the level of sense. So I think that for some people, it's a very helpful concept.
It being the word
Cult, yeah,
cult
and
or yeah,
brainwashing,
okay.
that sort of that
Yeah.
milieu. Um, but it's helpful for some people some of the times, but not for everybody all of the time. And so when you have a sampling of, I'm just throwing out numbers, these are arbitrary numbers, 50 people, and they report to you a certain experience, then that's your sample. And that's what you interpret from the experience. But when your sample is thousands of people, had and because I worked for the International Cultic Studies Association for 23 years and helped put on conferences and workshops and recovery, interacting with thousands of people, then I knew it wasn't everybody's experience. And so you have to either get wed to your theory, or you have to, always question your theory. And so I questioned my theory.
Right. So you're talking about that, your theory being the deprogramming
The
theory.
programming, that cults were these things, that you had this very clear definition, the common definition in the 70s and early 80s is that you have a group that has a pyramid structure. At the top is a living leader. At every level of the pyramid, different levels of information are given out. What the person at the bottom of the pyramid thinks the group is about is different at each level. That the group uses techniques that impair critical thinking, and they have hidden agendas. Well, that was a working model, but I can I know from experience groups that fit that. And I know people who joined those groups who knew exactly what they were getting into. They knew exactly what the doctrines were. It wasn't hidden to them. It might have been hidden to 99% of the people, but not to them, and they still joined. So these have become flaws or the cracks in the models. And I think that moving away from the idea that a model is accurate and represents reality like science, hydrogen, oxygen, and match, you get a glass of water, that kind of science, not that. It's social science, and it has, these are working models. And so when you question your own working theories or models, they're useful. They're useful tools for understanding the world, but they're not necessarily accurate all the time. And I think that's where I run into the word cult, and it starts being used, in the media for a particular reason.
It seems to me that usually that reason is to um, be able to villainize someone else or to absolve myself from responsibility.
I mean, could be for some people. Um, I think it's a shortcut. It's a term that's sort of like we as people, society goes, oh, that's a cult, and we sort of know, okay, that's what it means. But if you are someone who's writing about it or speaking like I am now about it, one has to become very specific of what that means. So there's the general idea, you know, like white people. Okay, they're white people. Well, there's means a lot of
Right.
different things, right? There's a lot of white people who are not white. They're a whole different shades of colors, but we just say they're white. But it's not accurate. And I think that the word, that's a weird example. I know where that came from, but I think the word cult is somewhat like that. We all sort of know what it means, but when you're really trying to talk about it in any kind of sophisticated way, then you get into nuance, and not all situations fit it.
Right. So to me, it feels maybe analogous to like some of the therapy words that are really popular right now. Like, oh, that person's a narcissist. Like everyone you break up with, they're a narcissist. And then you talk to someone who like an actual psychologist and they're like, well, narcissism is a specific thing and it's kind of a spectrum. And we don't just throw people into that category because we don't like them, but it's a really easy thing of like, well, you didn't do for me what I thought you should do for me, and you seem to be looking out for yourself, so you're a narcissist, you're bad. Now I'm better than
Yeah,
you.
well, I mean,
Or
certainly.
something.
So all these things, narcissism, anxiety disorder, depression, um, psychopath, they're on continuums, right? So we have anxiety, and then we have anxiety disorder. Well, we all experience some level. Most people experience some level of anxiety, but it's when does it have an effect upon someone? And so there are people who have anxiety that thrive, and somebody else who has the same level of anxiety can be immobilized. So it's how that individual interacts with that sort of label or that experience. Um, and I think that using the term cult, or the people that want a simple thing. Look, we live in a world right now with the assassination that occurred yesterday. It's easy sometimes to say conservative, liberal. These are dichotomies. It's just now we don't have to think about all the shades of gray. And so people are right now, because of what happened yesterday to Charlie Kirk, you have people in silos. So right now, there's no, there is, I'm sure it exists, but nuanced discussion. So if you come from a liberal point of view, you might not like him. If you come from a conservative view, you like him. If you come from sort of my viewpoint, God, the guy went out and went into environments and let people challenge him, and they didn't have him picked up and taken out. So we get into nuance, right? So uh, like that, I think that's what happens with cult.
Well, and what's funny to me is in that specific example, as far as like politically, you ask anybody, what are your political positions? Almost everybody says, well, I'm pretty moderate, but here's what the nation is. Well, if everyone in the nation is considering themselves moderate, where are the extreme right and the extreme left people? Like, it seems like dealing with people on their terms, as opposed to having two buckets and you either fit into this bucket or this bucket, so I know what to do with you, is more
Yeah,
helpful.
I mean, would probably be much more considered a liberal person. I have a whole wide spectrum in my family of political, from extraordinary left to far right. I was in a discussion group for about 2 years with almost all very conservative people, and they referred to me as one of the non-asshole liberals, which I thought
Okay.
was interesting in itself. Sort of that was my introduction. They introduced me to people. This is one of our non-asshole liberals. Okay. Um, and I just saw people wanting me to put me in a box that I don't fit in. And so, to illustrate it, when the Floyd thing happened in Minneapolis, and when we had this Black Lives Matter movement, this discussion group, became very polarized about Black Lives Matter. And so, my only experience with Black Lives Matter is where I live. Well, I live in Philadelphia, across from a park, in a rather liberal neighborhood. So the park is a block square. So when the riots started occurring, so to speak, the protests, the parents in my neighborhood gathered the children together to teach them about protest. So they had like sort of a little rally to teach them what protest looks like and how you protest. And the kids all made signs, and then they're walking around the park, and I actually took pictures of every single poster. I think it was a few hundred on the fences of the playground. And it was kind of interesting to watch these parents teach their kids. And then it came to a rally at the end, and the police were there. And this was like the most, nice event. There was no screaming, yelling. It was just teaching their children what protest means. So when the people were talking about the Black Lives Matter, I just said, "Well, my experience is it looks like this." And they're like trying to say this is a unique experience, that Black Lives Matter is this horrible socialist, blah, 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 blah. Well, it may be, but not in the 300 people. I could send you the pictures. They're great. The only person, it was very interesting, that caused any problem was a conservative, politically politically connected man who worked in the courts, who went around screaming, threatening people, and ripping down the children's signs. And he lost his job as a result. And I was on the news. It was a big thing. That was the only, you know, kind of disrupt, and then the children went back the next day and put up their little signs again. It was, but that's what it looked like to me. And in this discussion group, I'm trying to say, look, well, here's my pictures, here's what I see. And they said, well, in other parts of Philadelphia, there were, fires. I said, yeah, there were. So I remember going on to the city website in terms of properties, the number of properties in Philadelphia. How many of them are businesses? What percentage? I mean, I did all this, the numbers. I don't remember what it was, because what, 5, 6 years ago, and there may have been 100 buildings that had damage to them. But in the zone where these 100 buildings were, there were buildings that weren't, because the owners of the buildings came out and said, "Hey, this is my family's livelihood," and they were passed over. So it was such a small, I'm not justifying it, but it was a small percentage of this. So I'm in the 5th largest city in the United States, and I don't know how, what the total damage was, but it was minute, compared maybe to other places. So that discussion group, we're having this discussion, and no, every time I brought up, I just would post my pictures, and it annoyed the people. But it's just like, this is what I experienced. I come from a family. My dad's from South Dakota, where we all have guns. Um, it's tradition in my, tradition, like, not like it's like I have my grandfather's gun. I mean, these things are passed on. They were very useful. My grandparents met at the University of Minnesota. They homesteaded a farm in South Dakota. My grandfather died when he was 36, leaving my grandmother in the middle of nowhere with 7 Irish kids, in a 100-mile square with 1,000 people. She hunted for food, so, she got on the horse and went out to shoot pheasants. This was part of life, and she was a small woman, and she needed to defend herself. In the summer times, I grew up in Florida, we would go to South Dakota, and our sort of job, if we could call it that, was out on uncle's farm. We raised cattle, Black Angus cattle, and the gophers would dig holes, and the cattle's legs would go in them and break the leg, and then they would kill the cattle. And if you poison the gophers, well, that costs money, and the cattle could also be poisoned. So the kids, me and my sister, we would go out and we'd pick off gophers when we're 6 or 7 years old. So this is part of my, experience too. Uh, I think that people are crazy. Maybe they shouldn't have guns, right? I think that, I don't, not everybody needs them, but I have a fair amount of guns that were passed down in my family. And, I'm not a huge guy. So my father, when I moved to Philadelphia, brought me a 28 gauge shotgun. He said, "Pat, you're not that big, but this won't kill anybody. It's a 28 gauge shotgun, has about a 4-foot spray, but they won't hurt you." It's that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. It's not a so the conservatives in this group could relate that, well, he has guns, but I have liberal friends who cannot understand how he would have a gun. And I'm like, well, I see many points of view. And so that siloing that exists in society is similar to the siloing that goes about different groups. And to come in with any level of nuance or looking at any shades of gray is a problem for some people. And so when we as interventionists, even starting in the 90s, when people we were doing an intervention, there was a rehab center, a couple of them that people would go to. The people at the rehab center many times made a comment that the interventions, people that we brought to the rehab center, they weren't cleanly out. Like, that's an interesting thing, because they hadn't, like, adopted this new worldview of, brainwashing, mind control. They were left in questioning. And that's where I think my job would be to bring person not to what I want them to be at, but to help them come to a point where they can question and they're on their own, and their conclusion may be different than mine, but that's what we want to move people toward. And so that world, I mean, the way I think, is not necessarily how other people who've been hurt by groups think. And I understand that too, because I sued the group I was in federal court. So at some point I was hurt. I was, wanted my pound of flesh. And those concepts were useful to me. It helped me explain to myself what I'd gone through. But at some point, they're no longer useful in the same way. And that doesn't mean they're not useful for some people. I don't want to minimize anyone's experience around these terms like, oh, but when you start labeling people with labels, then it gets dangerous.
So, where
Answer
is
your
the
question.
what? Yeah, well, I mean that's all interesting. And I again, I appreciate your perspective, your non-extremist perspective on it, because it's like you're saying, a lot of people who, it seems like to me from an outsider, a lot of people who specialize in cults have very definite ideas, and it's very like true Scotsman fallacy-ish about like, oh, well, that one, and if I bring up an exception to it, well, that's not a real cult, that's not a true cult. Like, it's like, okay, sure, but like, and that's part of the reason that I called my own writing about it almost a cult, because it seemed irrelevant to put a label on it. I was in it. I know that a lot of the things that like define a real cult, a true cult, didn't apply to my situation or to my group, and yet they did way more damage than some of the groups that do fit that. And so it was like, for me, it was just a matter of, if we dissolve the term and deal with the facts of what's actually happening, it might provide a clearer narrative about what was actually going on there and what needed to happen.
Sometimes we talk about cultic relationships. So if potentially your relationship with the group was cultic, and somebody else might have attended and their relationship was not cultic. So when I left TM, I had a dabbling back in the Catholic Church in a Jesuit parish in downtown Philadelphia, a little bit more intellectual version of Catholicism. But in that, there was one of the Jesuit priests who was having visions of the Virgin Mary. I didn't know. And he had a little following. So he had some signal that he did during the Mass. I don't know what it was. Maybe when he crossed himself, he touched top. He did something that the people who were in the know knew he was seeing Mary. So it's the same church, same priest. There's those who had this little cultic relationship with him because they were having divisions. And then the rest of us, it was like, on Sunday we went to Mass and then we left. So it's the same group, same person, but some people had a special relationship with them and then didn't. And so, I think that that's what happens in many situations. Mind you, there are horrible cults. I'm using that in a very, strong way. There are horrible, horrible groups. There's a group 764 that I don't know if you've ever heard of it. And so I'd never heard of it until I was contacted by somebody that has concern about it. And if you Google 764, it's kind of scary. So I think it's a Vice article. And it involved these men who were grooming young children, 8, 9, 10 years old. And they were groomed on Discord and through gaming platforms and anime. The grooming occurred in those environments. And the kids were groomed slowly but surely. Obviously, not everyone who interacted with them did this succeed, to ultimately get people to commit suicide online for the satisfaction of these creeps.
Wow.
The children were also groomed to compete with each other for doing disgusting things to themselves, or cuts in their vagina, bleeding, for these guys online, and competing for diagnosis that they could get, the number of diagnoses they could get, and how long they could be put in the hospital, and
Wow.
then taught about concepts like trauma bonds, Stockholm syndrome, so that when those concepts were brought up, they already were prepared for those concepts.
Yeah.
So one of the families that was contacted me about their child, they found out their child was involved in this when the FBI had called them up and said, "We're at your house. You have a dog in at your door, and we're going to shoot the dog, or you can come here and open the door and let us in," because their 11-year-old child had been recruiting other children into this, and they had no
Yeah.
knowledge. Then these people were also, once they got it, began manipulating these kids. They would get them to get their parents' passwords, accounts, and they would take advantage of the whole family system. So I thought, this is pretty bad, and we can call this a cult. I have no problem. And I thought it was maybe the 10 families that I knew existed. I think it was in May, there was a Lady Gaga concert in Brazil. About 2 million people attended, and there were 2 or 3 people that got arrested were planting bombs, and turns out they were members of this group. They were accelerationists to bring about this change. They were kids. And then in ABC News, shortly after that, one night, I think it was a Wednesday, so we could probably figure out the day, they did a program, and they identified about 200 kids that were involved in this.
Wow.
So that's kind of cultic, and really bad, and so I wouldn't have much difficulty labeling that. But then you have to go back to, does someone have a cultic relationship? I'm sure they groomed people that it didn't stick. There were kids that they said, "This is crazy." What was made me come up or assume, okay, it's really it's a cultic kind of behavior, is that once a couple of the kids were out of this, knew what happened, they couldn't resist going back online, seeing who was
Yeah.
still there, and
Yep.
watching
Yeah.
what was going on. So there was a voyeurism that took place, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. So they had this sort of deep cultic relationship with the group.
That impulse, in my experience, is common pretty much across the board. It seems like either a compulsion to check back in and see who's still there, how's it going, are they still successful, have they shut down yet, or completely shut it off and go the opposite direction and go out of your way to avoid hearing about anybody from that group. Those seem like the most common responses. I don't know very many people at all who have left and then have somewhat of a no compulsion one way or the other by the group.
I think there probably are a spectrum, and maybe
You're so reasonable.
maybe if we look at it from statistically, there's one standard deviation. There's a lot of people in one category, one standard deviation. There's a lot in this category, but there might be some that sort of fit in somewhere else on that bell curve. Maybe that's informative around this is there was some research done by a friend of mine, Amanda Van, with a lot of, because she's from Dutch, so there's a lot of names followed.
Yeah, okay.
She got her PhD at London School of Economics studying SGAs, children who were born and raised in groups. And her study, I think, looked at 5 different groups. It's numerous years ago. So I think the groups were Scientology, the Unification Church, Children of God. I don't remember the other groups. And so she was looking at the children who were born and raised, and in our world, they call these SGAs, second generation adults, rather than someone like myself who joined a group. These kids were born into a group. And then there's multi-generational people who, the group's been going on for some period of time. And so what she sort of found is that the first cohorts, the first group that left the group, and they were on the outside, they really had a hard time because they were shunned in these cases.
These are SGAs
Yes, born and raised, and then I'm making this up to illustrate. Somebody's 17 years old and they leave. And they're now alone on the outside. They don't have anybody. They don't have any relationships with anyone. They may or may not know how anything functions in the world. May or not may know what it means to vote or to get a job. There's a whole host of different things they could have. So for that person, it's very difficult. But once they have established themselves on the outside, the second cohort that leave, they have a beachhead to go to, and it's much easier for them to. And then the third level of people who leave, in her research, the groups to some degree had acclimated to people leaving groups. Now, we're looking at a sample of a number of groups. This is not representative of all groups, but in her research, and those people could more freely go out and into the group. Essentially, the parents got used to it. And I think about that. I have 4 siblings. They're big spread, 15 years older than me, 10 years older than me, 8 years older than me, 5 years older than me. And so, the way my parents raised my older siblings, by the time I came around, it was like, okay, it wasn't the same experience that they experienced. So in that way, I think that's something that most people could relate to, that, if your parents are different at different times, people are different, they raise kids different, birth order, and that may be some insight into people leaving groups. But that first group, creating the beachhead, the second level, now having a place to go to, they have a relative, and then the third ones who could more freely sort of float in and out, it was easier for them to exist. And then some groups change, because they want to maintain, they want to live. Not all groups change, but some change and have to make accommodations for those situations. So people coming and leaving groups, they're going to have different experiences. And what I just described in these 3 levels, what we try to do in our approach to helping people is to create that safe beachhead on the outside. Because statistically, most people who join groups leave them. They leave them on their own. And the question is, do they have some place to come out to that's safe? And so can a family create an environment that is an easy glide path for them to come back to or relate with their, former, family or the people that were part of their lives?
So then, two related questions I think here. One, if you are the family member, how do you create what does a safe environment look like? And then if you don't have that beachhead, how can you create that safe environment for yourself if you're leaving and trying to recover?
So I guess that, there's would be a lot of definitions of that safe environment. The World Health Organization is, they have what do they call referred to as the determinants of mental health. Things that if these are that are pro mental health, not things that create problems, but things that are helpful. Employment, access to medicine, access to education, a roof over people's heads. And there's those types of things. Supportive environment, no shaming, blaming. So those are the things that I would like. When I work with families, we want to identify. Well, here's the determinants of mental health. Can this be created? I can't do that, but we can identify the qualities that it should have, and then the family that I would work with would then work with a therapist to see that can we make a healthy environment that there's for a easier place, a safer place to come out to. That has a couple effects. One is that ethically, it's an important thing to, you just don't say, hey, Johnny's in a group that we don't like, so he needs to come out. Well, come out to what? That's a question. But there's a man named Juan Carlos, and I forget his last name. He's at the University of Granada in southern Spain. And he did some research, which I found interesting, and we became friends on schizophrenia. And what he found was that if he could get a family to become sort of more integrated, on the same page, reduce conflict, if you could get the family sort of to approach their schizophrenic child or sibling in the same way and not break off and split off and do different approaches, that they could reduce the amount of antipsychotic medications.
If I'm hearing you correctly, that just means making sure that everyone in the family is reacting with a similar mindset.
Similar mindset, a similar approach. Person starts acting out. We're not going to try one approach, somebody else another approach. In the family, there's not going to be conflicts aren't going to be played out. The drama. We're going to have a venue for that. Maybe it's a therapist's office to deal with conflicts, but in front of the person, we're going to be more unified and healthy. So he applied the same idea to drug and alcohol. And he found, again, a very similar thing. We get everyone on sort of the same page. They were more effective in their treatment of an individual, rather than the splitting that often takes place in a family where there is drug and alcohol abuse. Someone has a substance abuse problem, where the abuser plays different family members in different ways. Somebody's helping them out on the street, just giving them $5 this time. They maybe just shut them up, or there's different reasons. So he was interested in our approach to dealing with people in groups because it's very similar. We won't create an environment that's healthy, that the conflict isn't there, and we can remove the things that in some way are not important. So if you're concerned about your child in a particular system, what's important? What is it that they are not making $250,000 a year, or they're not getting a PhD and they could be able to get their PhD? Is that important, or is it that they've left their children and they're not, they're not taking care of their health? I mean, what is the issue? And different family members will be concerned about different things, and so we want to try to get the family as a whole more on the same page. That we can eliminate the concerns that are, look, my parents might have liked it if I didn't go to Hindu U, but I mean, they would have preferred that I went to a PhD somewhere else. I mean, no, those are meaningless, but there are qualities that I think that if we can unify a family around, and I can't give them to them. So what we can try to do is help them refine their concerns so that they can express them in ways that are not polarizing.
If you're leaving something that a place where you have a cultic relationship with the group or with the leader, about how long on average would it take for you for a person to be able to feel more grounded or recovered?
I think that we're all humans, and there's that. It'd be easy to say a number. So there are people that come out of horrendous situations and just their natural resilience, they move on with their lives. There are people that come out of not so bad situations, and I've met them, and they're still in sort of recovery for that for 20 years. But it's how does an individual process that? What's the uniqueness of who we are? Uh, what's disturbing to one person is not disturbing to another person. How we're wired as humans, they're all wired differently. And so I don't know that we can say a year, 6 months, because I see people leave systems that were horrendous and they just, the next day they go on. And this is not an analogy to drugs. I just mean to make an analogy to drugs, but I'm not saying that group involvement in drugs are the same. But in the drug world, programs like AA are about 10% effective. We really don't know why people stop using drugs. We know that rehab seems to work for some percentage of the people. I think there is some statistics, maybe 7 30-day rehabs or some number of them before someone, sort of becomes off drugs. Some researchers think that people age out of using drugs. I know people that were abusers, and one day they just got up and said, that's not for me anymore," and they go on and live their lives. There are other people that are in recovery for their entire lives. Sometimes they have a difficulty understanding each other. So those who are in maybe a particular 12-step program think that these people are white knuckling it, so they have ways of dismissing they are, but we're wired differently. So I have something, a cognitive issue, neurodivergence, so that I don't see pictures in my head. So it's called aphantasia.
I'm sorry, I think I spoke over you. What?
Aphantasia.
Okay, and are you able to dream?
Yes, and people who have aphantasia can dream, but you can't volitionally bring up pictures in your head. We happen to be very good spatially, so they can be architects, but just don't see pictures. And so people who see pictures in the head, which is 95% of the population, they can't fathom how you could not see pictures in your head. Reason why I bring it up is that people who have aphantasia, it's very easy for them to stop using drugs. They frequently can just stop using drugs. In my research on aphantasia, this is what I came up with. Because maybe one of the sensory systems that says that you're wired into with the drug isn't there, visual. You can have aphantasia around hearing in your head and other senses also. But people who have it, it's easier for them to stop. Not everyone. Again, it's not everyone who has aphantasia, but it is an attribute that. So now we have, you have 5% of the population who are of drug abusers that maybe have aphantasia. For them, one day they can just say, "I don't want to do it," and so because we're wired differently, we're unique, and so groups tend to, depending on the group, want people to be the same. This is the ideal person. It's this shape, this color, this shape. They respond to things in this way. But that's not real life. We're this whole spectrum of humanity, and we're different. And so we want people in groups to see the nuance, the texture of life, the differences. That's what makes it interesting. Yet sometimes when we look at people leaving groups, we want them to be the same. And it's not.
It seems to me, I was born in 81. I didn't live through the 60s. It seems like somewhere in the 60s or 70s, there grew a hysteria over this stuff that seems extremely late in human history for this to come up. Am I just seeing it wrong? Or like, it seemed like the whole like MK Ultra, brainwashing, mind control, cults, Patty Hearst is in there, and like, and it seemed like there was a whole like line from the 70s through the even in the early 90s. It was just like cult after cult after cult after cult, and deprogramming. Did that really rise up that way, or have we had this awareness of or fear of brainwashing and witchcraft for a long time?
I don't have a good answer for the question, so because I don't know the data. So we could look at Catholic convents from the 30s, 40s, 50s, in history. Someone joined the convent when they were, I'm making this up, 16 years old. They shaved their heads. They never went home to their family again. Their names were changed. Maybe once a year, depending on the order, they could have 10 minutes or an hour or two a day with their family. Their whole lives were structured and controlled. That existed. Now, there were times where families, you have 10 kids, and I think of Irish families, and you can't feed them all. And 3 of them become priests or nuns, solves a lot of problems.
All right.
And so we've looked at that in a different way. So, and that's why I say I don't know the data. So depending on the society where we are, some of these could be considered would have the same issue. I was working in Cyprus a few times, and so coming from an Irish Catholic family, the idea of having a son who's a priest, at least one, is like, that's such a good thing, or a nun. I mean, every parent seems to want somebody to be a nun or a priest. Not that there was any in my family. Oh, they're in the past, my relatives, bishops and nuns, but not in my immediate family. In Cyprus, it was looked on as a shame for your child to become a monk. Culturally, that's where the people who were not with it went, that could succeed. Well, culturally, it was looked at in a different way than in an Irish Catholic family. Doesn't mean that there's Irish Catholic families that don't think there's something wrong with a kid becoming a monk or thing, but this was a shame.
Right. It was like a fallback option as opposed to something you chose, perhaps.
And so, that's the same thing. So if we look at the person who joins the monastery, becomes a cloistered monk in Cyprus, they're thinking they've been brainwashed. A family might think that. Whereas, the Irish Catholic family in Florida, it's like, oh, my son's a priest. He's going off to the monastery. Same kind of controls, but culturally a different perspective on it.
I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're coming up on an hour here. Is that...
We're good.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you about your trans research, which is probably not a small topic. Can you get into that a little bit, or do you feel like we probably don't have time? Or would you prefer not to?
Generically, what I was interested in, this is just an interest, is groups that, and there's a few of them, that required people for religious or philosophical reasons to trans.
And for people who haven't heard of this before,
so if we put it in a philosophical or religious kind of context, there's a kind of Gnosticism from the 1st century called Valentinian Gnosticism, and I don't know if Valentinian was the first or second, what year, we can look it up. And Valentinian Gnosticism had this idea that there's this perfect world with a plethora, and in that world there are 21 pairs of perfect beings, male and female. And in that perfect world, or these perfect beings, one of the beings, they're called aeons in the Gnostic myth, decided, her name was Sophia, the goddess of knowledge, and she thought that she could create a child. She did not need a mate because she's a god, and so she created this being. And that being, because it was not made with her mate, her complement, her twin flame, it was made out of balance and was jealous, evil, and she needed to get it out of the perfect world, and she created where we live, the earth. And that is the God of Genesis in the Gnostic story, that does not want you to eat of the fruit of knowledge of how to become a god. So this is the Gnostic one Gnostic myth, one Gnostic version of Genesis. So if you take those ideas and you bring it up to 2020, and you have a group that the leader, and in Gnostic myth, there are people can connect with these beings. So you move it forward 2,000 years, and you have a group where a leader presents themselves as being able to connect with the great beyond and find your complement, your twin flame. And so in the and then you will have an ideal relationship, because from eternity, from when you were a spark, you have been searching out for your twin flame.
Now, these groups that promote this idea, is it that spiritualized? Do they point back?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So
it's not just like a they don't repackage it.
Oh,
like
they repackage it, but I'm just when I gave the Gnostic myth, I'm giving the context from where these ideas likely came from.
Right. So I guess if you were in one of those groups, would you hear that story?
You may hear some version of that story. I mean, most good groups will have some philosophical background, reference that, these ideas aren't new, but the whole concept of twin flames comes from this myth. I mean, the idea was generated at some point in history. So in this particular group, the leader, they promise to find your complement for you, and through their processes and finances and commitment. But the leaders may decide for somebody like, you have a feminine energy, actually. And I know that your name is Marianne. And you're going, not Marianne, not feminine energy. And oh, yeah. And, your ego is keeping you from being who you really are, and pressure to you may go for gender correction. So, families contacted me about this group where their daughters were having mastectomies, they were on cross-sex hormones, their sons were on cross-sex hormones. And so I'm not going to put a value, judgment, or an opinion on that, other than these are not people who had dysphoria. These are not people who had questions about gender. These are individuals who were coerced into. Now, they might have rewritten their story and said they did have gender dysphoria, but they were coached into what to say when they went to a gender clinic, what to say to get cross-sex hormones, what to say, and the path was thin because someone told them that they were trans. So that's one group that occurred in. Primarily, this occurred to members of the group that were gay or lesbian, because you had to be male or female. So if there were two guys, the leader may present that you should be transitioned to female. At some point,
because they were lacking in potential twin flames.
Yes. So it's I'm going to make this up. You have a group of that's got 100 people, and 80% of them were heterosexuals, and you got 20% are gay guys. Well, there's not enough members, so now so now you need to change. Look, I'm simplifying complex issues. There's another group, the Zizians. You might have heard about them recently. They've been doing a little bit of murdering around the country. And they have a process of a way of dreaming and keeping people awake through this. They have a process. And many members of that group are trans or have been brought into the idea that everyone is. No, there are other groups. So it became very interesting to me. Now we have an issue that generally we haven't come across, in the sort of the cult world. Although Trump or someone says this is a trans cult, and there's that. So there's that surface level thing. I was at the University of Athens last year, talking to a bunch of psychiatrists about forced gender transition, and addressing this idea that there's a book in a library is brainwashing. Is really hard for me, because I was at the Maharishi U, and the 5 years I was there, I spent 18 months in courses that were in length of a month to 3 months, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Then I'll go to the bathroom alone, watch TV, read newspapers, go home, write letters. You went to the bathroom if you were in your dorm alone, but if you were at a meeting and you had to get up, somebody went with you. And the days were structured down to seconds, 15 seconds to do this, and you're meditating. So my eyes were closed, let's say 20 hours a day. That kind of fits more into a highly controlled environment. So with that kind of intensity, most people left and they left on their own. So I don't know how you compare a book on a shelf in a library at a public school to that. I mean, I have questions that, so if we're going to talk about any even theory of brainwashing, this kind of fits more into it, into a model. A book on a library, not so much. So those are things that were curious to me. So there was, again, this wide brush of why people transition, but I was really just interested in the people who coerced in some way to have gender transition. So, and the question I had, and it was just an interest, is if we were to work with somebody who had gone through some type of gender transition, either socially or chemically or surgically wise, what resources do we have in this sort of there's that word, recovery field? What are those resources that exist? Because there's no reason to send someone to someone who's going to deal with the medical side of it, who has no knowledge of sort of group influence and how that would happen. So where do we have something to offer? And so I became interested in people who had detransitioned, and that led me to starting to interview people who had detransitioned, not from the groups that I've referred to, but people who had gone through that. At some point in their life, they thought they were trans. They transitioned at some level, either from just changing a pronoun or not changing a pronoun to socially transitioning or not socially transition, doing surgery or not surgery. There's a whole host of the thing. And I wanted to interview and sort of just get some insight. Again, not from a right, wrong, black, white, just try to understand what are the needs. So a couple colleagues and I put together an exploratory instrument. And that's all it was an exploratory instrument to a survey of people who detransition, to ask them what their needs were. Although some people would see this as highly controversial, I don't think it's controversial to ask someone who's made a decision to detransition what resources they need. It's not an opinion on transing or not transing. And so about a little over 400 people took the instrument and identified what their needs were. It was both quantitative and qualitative. It's not published. It can't be published because there's issues with because it was just an exploratory survey. It would have difficulty related to there's no clear definition of what trans means, so there's no clear definition of what detransition means. So you're not comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing all different kinds of things. But it did bring up some interesting perspectives of suicidality, drug use, drug addiction, in this community, and what resources would be helpful if you see those, if there's suicidality and you have a high percentage of this small sample, of people who had that, then you want to make sure that any resources you have for people who decide to detransition, that it's there. And some went on to retransition. So you have to, what are the resources? And a couple of the folks that I personally interviewed felt that when they transitioned, in some way it was like joining a tribe of people that were very supportive. And sure, if you're feeling different than other people, you feel a different identity, you have gender dysphoria, any of the ideas, and you associate with people who understand you, that's, it's not a negative thing. That's what happens in the people who leave groups. They find other people who left groups, and now they relate with each other, and they can commiserate, and then they leave with all different viewpoints. So here's a bunch of people who are in groups, and some go to some kind of religion, some are not, some, they take all kinds of different paths. There's not one. It's what's right for that individual. So with this idea of the few people that to talk to me, they felt like they joined a tribe, and there were of individuals who were highly supportive of them. But when they changed their mind, that same group of people was not as supportive of them and questioned their question them. Said maybe they have internalized transphobia. They became, questioning them, and in a few cases, the people felt shunned by their social group. Again, this is not a trans yes, no. It's just looking at here's a group of people who've presented themselves and are self-identified having transitioned, self-identified having detransitioned, and in that there is some subset of that who feel like they don't have any friends and they've been rejected by their group. And so that was interesting to me. So, because that's an area that we have experience with in sort of the recovery world or the education, the psychoeducation of people in and out of groups. So can we provide some resources so that maybe someone doesn't feel guilty because they changed their mind? They're going to have other issues that we can't address. And that's what spurred it on. And then I went a little further, bringing up a few issues that I think that the anti-trans community has and the trans community has, and neither group was very happy with my perspectives. Um, the anti-trans people said that people were brainwashed, and they used it in a way like Dr. Lifton and his research on brainwashing, as a thought-terminating cliche. Lifton says that of the 8 themes of thought reform or course of persuasion, one is what he called loaded language, the reduction of very complex issues to short, easily memorized cliches that have the effect of non-thought. Short, easily memorized cliches that have the effect of not thought. Liberal, conservative, you have these polar communist, socialist, you got these dichotomies. And in a similar way, the idea that people are brainwashed in an ideology, it was like maybe yes for some, maybe no for others. So when Trump passed his ban on gender care for people under 18, I was interviewing a therapist in New York who had a client base of young people who were in that world of transition, not transition. If I was to guess, just a guesstimate, I would assume that these kids whose parents are supporting them, whatever it is, would come from more liberal families. That was just a working assumption. I didn't even question the assumption. What she found in her sample of her clients, now we're not talking hundreds, we're talking a small amount, about a third of the kids that were going to be identified as trans, that were going to be denied gender affirming care, were conservative, and they loved the president and they supported the president. They had no connection between the policies of this person and how it's going to affect them. I wouldn't have thought about that. So that the idea that the liberal thing has done this was like there's a question in that. About a third of her patients felt relief that they didn't have to do this. If somebody is going to, and a third of the people were very upset because this is your identity. So these are anecdotal, but they're instructive in that even if it's one person out of a million, it's somebody that we can look at that nuance around that for that person it's not there. So in my talk in Athens, I was like challenging the people who are like, this is brainwashing because it just doesn't seem to hit that. And then on the other side, you have people that are come from, a very advocate point of view in the trans community that would refer to someone even who has a question in a negative way. So this sort of black and white thinking exists, and that removes nuance. And that is something that I saw in the discussion, in this trans discussion, that I saw in the cult world in the 80s. This cult, not cult, brainwashing, not brainwashing, those battles existed. And I saw that happening until people moved to a more nuanced, looking at individual perspective. And so, I mean, that's really, sort of where my interest is in that, that if someone feels that this is not for them, I'm not an advocate in one way or other. I am concerned that when we make policy, government policy, that you cannot provide gender care for children, that those laws have unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences I want to talk about are not um, the kids are suicidal or any of those types of things. It's about 3,500 kids are born a year in the US that their chromosomes are not XX or XY. They could be XXY, they can be born as genetically female and have male genitalia. They can be born genetically male and have female genitalia. They may have both genitalia. There's about 3,500 people. So this year there's 3,500, and then this year and next year 7,000, and then it keeps on growing. So there is a cadre of people that need care because of what their how they were born. They're not male and not female in that sense of that binary sense. This is not the nuance of, identity and constructs and that. I'm just saying biologically they're different and they need care. And if you're denying people care that need care, that's a problem. In the same way, with the abortion rules. So and regardless of how you feel about abortion, there are women who have died because they couldn't get ectopic pregnancies taken care of, or they were carrying a dead fetus, and doctors would not perform the care that they needed because they didn't want to go to jail. So the unintended consequences of legislation around these, I'm not pro or not against, I'm just saying there's unintended consequences that some people are going to be hurt. And if we look at that, that's the theme of what we've been talking about, from the cults to, politics to gender, that we have to look at the grays and move away from the black and white, because the black and white gets us nowhere. Yesterday, when the assassination took place, it was interesting to me. The governor of Utah, very conservative Republican, gave a talk about, hey, we have to come together as a country. We have to get out of these silos. It was just a very thoughtful and nuanced, uplifting talk. And then we have somebody more senior in politics who's out there that's a dumb, this is the fault of the liberals. And so it just like, this is not a helpful discussion. And it's not a helpful discussion, be it guns. It's not a helpful discussion, be it race. It's not helpful. Moving people in general to nuance and looking at the grays doesn't make either camp happy.
So then I'm curious, perhaps to wrap this up, just in my life experience, I don't run into nearly as many people as I wish I did who have your affinity for nuance and gray areas and allergy to black and white thinking. What do you think has brought you to that place, and how is that thing most effectively spread in the world?
I don't know. I mean, some of it, I would say my father, who, came from South Dakota, rode a horse to school, was one of the highest ranking enlisted men in the United States Navy, one of the kindest people I've ever met, who respected people, had opinions, but respected people have the right to be who they want to be. So when I wanted to go off and study at a Hindu university, and I wanted to convince my father that he should also learn to meditate and do these things, he would listen to me for days. Never made me wrong. He would try to find ways to find commonality. And so I remember, doing the sales job to get him to meditate. And I remember clearly, it was over a Christmas holiday. He said, Pat, or he didn't call me Pat, he called me, well, man, you have found what makes you happy. And that makes me happy. What makes me happy is riding a horse. So if I had 5 minutes extra in the day, I would go ride my horse, because that's what brings me happiness and satisfaction. I am pleased that you found what brings you happiness and satisfaction. So there is a little bit of that mindset culture that he came from. And as kids, when we would run into people that we had conflicts with, he would say, everybody gets an allotment of 20 assholes a year. You have one less, you have 19 more to look forward to. And when somebody would be doing odd things, he would say, that's their privilege. They're a human being. They can be a jerk. That's their privilege as being a human being. And at the same time, there was a kind of anecdotal story about my dad. The head of the Hells Angels was in St. Petersburg. My father ran into him, and he had a third eye on his forehead. My father was looking
Yeah.
at the third eye, and the guy goes like, "What the fuck are you looking at?" And he goes, "Well, any goddamn fool who would put that on their forehead wants to be looked at, so I'm looking at it. Now, what is it? I mean, I'm interested in why you did it." So, in that, he called him an asshole, all that, but really he was interested in why the person did that. And I think that that curiosity and respect for other people and their own opinions, I learned from him. I don't always abide by it, and I didn't always abide by it. So there's those influences, and then there are, academics that have, challenged me, um, in my ideas, and I think that it's most people don't want people to challenge them. And I think that that's how you learn. So I mean, so part of it's my father, part of it's how I'm wired, part of it's the environment I put myself in. It's very hard for people not to go back to a knee-jerk silo. It's just hard because you're not friends with anybody. Both sets of people dislike you, and if they're siloed.
But the people that exist in that space, it's such a wonderful community of non-community of
More
non-extremists.
people are in there
Um,
than I think than we realize. Uh, let me think. I live in Philly. There are some extraordinarily conservative people on my block that I'm friends with. We don't agree on some politics, but, when I wanted this gun my father gave me, it needed to be shot. I wasn't sure if it, he was willing to take it up to the Poconos and shoot it and give me, I mean, it's like they're not used to people that can find areas of agreement. A friend of mine who's a Catholic monk talked about it one time. He was talking about interfaith dialogue, and his name is Mike Simo. Um, Father Philip Seymour, excuse me, at St. Anselm's Abbey in Washington, D.C., and he does interfaith dialogue. And he was giving a talk with me, and somebody asked him some question, and then he put a question out. He said, "We do interfaith dialogue with Islam. So how do you think that works?" And I was like, I'm just, up there with him at the front table and thinking, "Where's this going?" And I had no idea how it would start. And he said, when we do interfaith dialogue with Islam, we start with the Virgin Mary." Okay, now I'm like lost, right? Like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? He said that when Muhammad had his visions and him and his brothers went around taking out the iconography, the icons out of the churches and cutting off the crosses, because in Islam, you don't have that. There was one icon that Muhammad's brother said could stay, and that one was of Mary holding the infant Jesus. So he said, that's where we have commonality, and that's where we start. We start where we can find agreement. And, so in interfaith dialogue, in diplomacy, we find areas of agreement, and we can focus on the areas of agreement. We don't have, it doesn't mean we don't hold different views, but we don't have to have a battle about everything. Some things are worth having intense discussions around, and others are not. But just because somebody holds a different view from you doesn't make them a bad person. And so I think a fundamental to this is respect. And if we can respect people that we disagree with, it's important. And part of it, working for the International Cultic Studies Association for 23 years at conferences, I had to get along with people that came that had different views than me, and I had to be respectful to them. And in doing that, we developed some type of relationship. And those silos that we both came from started coming down because we saw more commonality than differences. And when you interact with people that you disagree with and you understand how they perceive things, I think that you can understand it more, and maybe you can become more adaptable. Doesn't mean that you don't hold different views, because understanding does not mean agreement.
What a beautiful way to end.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you so
welcome.
much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, my beautiful distant cousins, for joining me. And if you liked that, you might want to check out my episode that I did with cult expert Rick Allen Ross for a slightly different take on the field. Hopefully it's evident that I spend considerable effort putting these together so you can have them for free. And if in turn you would click a couple buttons to give me something for free, then we can keep this good thing going between us. And if you'd like to become a super fan, then follow the link in the description to join Team Possibly Wrong and find free ways to show your support and keep this love train rolling. Be well, my distant cousins. I'm rooting for you, and you should too.